turn it on. Off from my city, off from my home. We're flying up, no ceiling when we in our zone. I got that sunshine in my pocket, got that good soul in my feet. I feel that hot blood in my
Trish is not going to make me dance again. For those of you who were here earlier, Trish made me dance. I'm hoping none of the other speakers have such requests. So, sorry if you missed the dance party, but we've got some more excitement. Looks like there's a lot of interest in sales development, so you're going to be excited about this next session. Let's keep the engagement going, and we'll make sure we leave plenty of time for questions. So continuing along this theme, we're going to be talking in this next session about building a culture for optimizing growth. The moderator for this panel is David Premier. He's the Vice President of Corporate Sales, Commercial Sales, pardon me, at Salesforce. He's a friend of mine and a colleague. We've worked together for 4 years. But David's actually spent the majority of his career in the startup world. He's going to be moderating a panel of industry experts and leaders. We're going to be talking about the core tenets, talking about how you can build a culture of engagement, of teamwork, of hustle and personal growth to build a high-velocity sales development organization. So let's welcome up David and the series of panelists.
All right, excellent. All right, welcome everyone. Oh, we're on, we're hot. We're hot. I'm just hot off the heels of telling Simon Sinek that I had a man crush on him, so I'm feeling pretty good. Right about now. All right, true story. All right, welcome everyone. Really appreciate you coming here today. Our job here is to add value to your experience, and we have a really great panel of folks here to talk about culture. So all the way on the right, we have Jason Everett, who is a sales manager at LinkedIn, Emmanuel Scala, who's a VP of sales at Influitive, and Sam Jacobs, who's the SVP of sales at Livestream. The great thing about this panel is that it's an amazing combination of folks who work at big companies, small companies, who have startup experience, entrepreneurial experience, navigating in big organizations. So I think we're going to get a lot of really great perspectives today. So welcome everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good to be here.
All right. So I want to share an interesting story. So I've been in sales for 16 years. This is the first time this thing has ever happened to me. So about a month ago, I got a call from one of my managers. And the manager says, David, I want to talk to you about something. I got a flip, from a lead flip from one of our SDRs, kind of came to me. And I said, well, that's strange. Why would a lead come to you? And he said, well, this is a bit of a strange one. The prospect said they're not a customer of ours. They'd like to learn more, but they would prefer not to talk to a woman. They want to talk to a man. We're all just kind of taking a little bit aback here, and he said, well, what should we do, right? And so we all encounter decisions in our business every day that we're not prepared for, that we didn't go to training for, right? There's no manual at our company that says, oh, here's how you respond in that kind of situation, right? And so from the perspective of culture is really one of those things that drives us. It's that invisible hand. It helps us make decisions that are in the best interest of our customers and the organization that we were never prepared for. And so, when I think about culture and the importance of it, it's one of those things that helps us make decisions. There was a great article in TechCrunch a couple of years ago, and it was called Culture Eats Strategy for Breakfast. And it tells the story of a New York executive, a New York entrepreneur, who said, hey, what, I used to think culture was really BS, like it's soft rainbows and unicorns kind of stuff, until my first company failed. And it didn't fail because we lacked the people and the process and the technology. It lacked because we lacked it failed because we lacked the resiliency to get through the tough times. And so I'm really keen to hear from our folks today. The first question is like, who cares, right? The inclination when you think about something like culture is to say, oh, that's nice. Let's worry about crushing sales and getting the best technology in place and getting the right people on the bus. But really, who cares? Maybe we'll start with Sam. What do you think? What's the who cares around culture?
Well, I also believe that culture eats strategy for breakfast, so it's a belief that I have as well. And I remember reading about it when Ford was trying to go through a reinvigoration before they hired Alan Mulally. So for me, culture is really, the word means, I think, the set of shared beliefs that your organization has. And I also think that it's just the critical it's the critical ingredient in scaling an organization. And the reason is because any organization, and particularly early stage companies, they're going to be messy. Your processes aren't going to be perfectly defined. Even if you're like me or Emmanuel or Jason, where you've done this before, we have a playbook that we're going to run for sales development and for sales. But every situation is different, every business is different. And the thing that gets you through the difficulty is the set of shared beliefs. So where does it start from my perspective? Because I think if you go across all different organizations, I think some of us will say that people have different culture, different values, but I think the values are actually pretty common across a lot of the sales ecosystem and the sales environment. So how do you get a differentiated culture? And for me, there was a coach that I had many years ago. He said every interaction that you have with somebody, people are thinking, are you for them? Are you for yourself? Or are you against them? Most people don't assume that you're against them. Most people don't assume that you're a misanthrope, but they're trying to understand if you're self-interested. And I think if you're trying to build a great culture, first and foremost, people have to believe that the leadership and the other people in the organization are truly there to help them develop, there to help them grow. And if they believe that their leaders are authentic, transparent, communicative people, then I think that's going to make them want to do more and to do better. So I think that's, for me, part of where it starts. It also starts with hiring the right people. But of course, I'm interested to hear what Emmanuel and Jason have to say.
So obviously, I agree with everything you said, Sam. Especially about the highs and the lows that a company, especially early stage company, will naturally have, and how culture is going to be able to even those out. But very specifically to a sales organization, it's even more important. Not that it's not important everywhere, but I think in sales it's a little more important because of the dynamic in sales. We get a lot more no's than we get yeses. Right? We have 50% of our comp is generally at risk. Those are things that make those highs and lows significantly more deeper. Right? So it's much more of a roller coaster in sales, and if you don't have a strong culture that can help even that out, it's going to be too easy for people to leave, to get off the bus, to get demotivated, and then when all those things start happening, it becomes kind of a cycle that potentially could take you into bad places. So a strong culture is going to allow for those salespeople to be able to handle the no's, to be able to handle the ups and downs and the roller coaster that is naturally sales. I think a culture in sales starts with, I'm going to go to Simon Sinek, but it really does start with the why. It really does start with believing in what you're selling. If you can't believe in what you're selling, then you're not going to be able to sustain those highs and lows. You're not going to be able to have a culture that brings people together. And that's going to make your job as a salesperson really, really, really tough. So that's why I think it's particularly important in sales.
So, so Jason's been in this position where his company's been recently acquired, right?
Yep.
We've all heard the news.
Yep.
And so I'd love to hear kind of the role of, what do you think about who cares, and maybe any insight into how culture has kind of permeated some of the discussions in the last week or so.
Yeah, whoa, loud. All right, let's do this. Everyone lean in. I found it interesting that after the acquisition, the first thing that Jeff talked about and the first thing that Satya talked about was culture. I think it was the thing that our employees were most interested in. Did they feel like what we had created at LinkedIn could translate into the Microsoft ecosystem? So I think that demonstrates top down the importance of culture, and also bottom up that employees also care. The way that I think about culture as it relates to my role as a sales manager is that it's a lot like religion. There are the rules that govern the day-to-day work that we do together. Thou shalt not kill. It helps us understand the basic operational work that we get done. But then there's the wealth of unknown that occurs in high-growth organizations where you never actually, it's impossible to say what's going to happen tomorrow. So in that world of lack of clarity, lack of complete knowledge, how do you set in place rules or value systems that allow you to decide in future situations where there are no rules? So I think that the best cultures do both of those things. They help you deal with the operational exchange between employees as like a sort of lubricant, and then it helps you navigate unknown future events that are hard to deal with.
lots of unknown future events. People, when I tell the story about that I led off with, the person wanted to speak to a man, not a woman. People say, well, how did that end? And so I talked to the manager and said, well, trying to be a good coach, what do you think we should do, right? And he thought about it, and he said, well, he's thinking in his head, okay, what should I do? Not every organization, there's really two answers to this question. Either I comply with the request, or I don't, right? And every you have those two choices. That decision may be different in your company versus ours, right? In our company, we have a very clear culture around equality. And so he thought about it, and he said, you know what? I'm going to go back to the customer. I'm just going to have to say, hey, look, if we respect your opinion, but if you don't want to talk to a woman, then Salesforce is probably not the company you want to be doing business with. And he went back, and that's the message he delivered. I'm curious. There's all sorts of things that we do in the name of culture in our organizations. We see at the end of the quarter, the end of the year, a sales rep leaves their desk for a moment, the phone rings, and a colleague goes to pick up the phone because they don't want them to miss the sale at the end of the year. We see that all the time. It's a really, really awesome story. I'm curious to hear, what are some of the awesome things that have happened in your organizations because of culture? Because we're talking about culture, and culture is kind of like going to the gym. We all believe intrinsically, like this is a good idea, we should wrap our heads around. But really, how does it get manifested? So maybe, Emmanuel, how have you seen that happen?
Sure. So one of our value statements in my sales team is excel individually and collectively. And so we do have a culture of, of course, everybody wants to be number one because that's what we do in sales, right? But everyone really wants the next guy to be 1 percentage point behind so that we can all, excel collectively. And so kind of a couple of things that's happened recently that shows that manifests itself. We actually had a brand new rep. It's kind of itchy. I think it's so. We had a brand new rep who got promoted from an SDR to a rep, and we gave him, obviously we carved up territories, and he got some accounts that had been previously worked, but had been stalled, or opportunities that hadn't gone very far. And he got one in the transition that was actually a little bit further ahead than we might normally do in a transition. And the old rep who had the account could have easily made a case for, that's my account, this is not fair, et cetera. Did not, and instead actually booked 2 hours of time with him, told him everything he needed to know about the account, shared all of his notes with him, all of his research with him to help his peer win the deal, when it easily could have been justified that it was his to keep in the first place. And that is because we very much have a culture of we win together.
Yeah, I could actually build on that. At LinkedIn, one of the ways that we tackle culture is by starting immediately at new hire training. Everyone probably does this, but it's not just like, hey, here are the things that we believe, here's our value system. It's, we are going to put you into a variety of scenarios in which our values are going to come into play. And the way that we test for whether or not our values are sinking in is whether or not you can articulate back to us what value I need to apply into this situation, and then what the outcome of that situation should be. So for instance, we have a policy where if deals are sold internationally, let's say you're selling a global deal and APAC gets a piece of it, the APAC rep gets credit for that. Even if you're selling on behalf of everyone, they get a piece of it. And that's part of selling as a team sport, which is a value. So in new hire training, we will run through that scenario as a precursor to what people are actually going to experience in the field, so that rather than telling people one time in new hire training and putting it on the wall, and then the situation pops up, people are pissed, and then we reactively say, hey, look at that thing that we believe. Instead of that, we say, ideally, we should not say. They should say, oh, this is exactly what you told me was going to happen, and this is how we feel about it.
We talk a lot about the role of leadership in building culture, and for some organizations, it's like a toss-up. It's like, whose responsibility is it? Is it the responsibility of the leaders to develop the culture, or the people to sustain it and propagate it? There was a great article last year, a couple years ago, written in First Round Capital, and it told the story of Mark Zuckerberg and how they went through at Facebook this, they called it the one of us exercise. So early on in Facebook, and this was not native to Facebook, they had borrowed this from other companies, they went through this exercise called the one of us exercise, which is write down on a piece of paper what it means to be one of us. And what they found was, as Mark was kind of writing out what the engineering mindset and really driven and want to change the world, he was basically describing himself, right? And so what we sometimes don't realize is that as leaders, we create our organizations in our image. And so we have a great responsibility to infuse the culture. I know, Emmanuel, you mentioned that operationalizing culture is a bit of an oxymoron. Like, how do I force people to behave in a certain way? But it is nonetheless our responsibility as leaders to help instill that culture. So I'm curious, maybe Sam, how have you seen that leadership-infused culture in your organization?
Well, just to your point, I do feel like sometimes we don't realize the extent to which the leadership drives the culture. And so part of, for better or for worse, the culture of an organization is going to resemble the leaders in the organization. My tenets tend to start with transparency, openness, and empathy, which sounds a little wishy-washy maybe for a sales organization or for any organization, but it's really, Andy Grove in High Output Management talks about there's two ways the way to measure an output of an individual is, first of all, do they know what they're doing, and then do they want to do it? And that collectively is the motivation, and then the talent that gets them to do the job. And if they don't have the motivation, then they're not going to be able to do it. So first and foremost for me is creating an environment where they trust me and where they feel like I care about them and where they feel like they can develop. And then from there, I think operationalizing the culture is about embedding and deepening the leverage of those values into the organization. I think what Jason said is true, and it's the best practice at this point, right? You need to have your values documented and articulated so that you can point to them. If they're not painted on the wall, you've given some kind of presentation where you say, this is what we believe in, we've all agreed that we believe in, and this is the direction we're going to march. And then the other thing that you do is, to the point of sales development, to the point of the panel, is you try to bring people. I've found two ways to scale culture over the course of my career. One of them is to diffuse responsibility into smaller and smaller teams as you grow. And then the second is to begin at the beginning and essentially nurture homegrown talent that you can promote up through the organization. So as Emmanuel was saying, SDRs come in as an SDR, and I think that the career ladders can become more and more sophisticated as you go. So I know, Greenhouse, which is great applicant tracking software and human resources management software, they've got a number of different steps in their SDR ladder before you become an account executive. That progression, that's the thing that deepens the culture, because you've got people that begin with their career with you. They don't know, they haven't learned any bad habits or bad lessons, and then you can nurture and develop them through the course of their career, and that is how you preserve the culture. I think that's part of the operationalization of it, in my opinion.
Yeah, so we talk about preserving the culture as we grow. Part of the challenge becomes, as your company grows, you become a little bit more disconnected from things, right? So if I were to ask folks on a given sales team or an SDR, like, hey, how's life at your organization? I might hear things like, it's intense, and it's a grind, and things change all the time, and there's all sorts of conflicting priorities. But if I were to ask the leadership, they might say, oh, no, there's a lot of hustle and a lot of fun. It's like the same way that if you ask me, how do you like traveling? I'm like, oh, it's great. I get to go to all these offices and meet all these great people and go to these great conferences. And if you ask my kids, they say, why does daddy always have to go, right? That's different perspectives. So I'm curious, so maybe Emmanuel, as you think about your journey across startups that have grown and been subsequently acquired by very big organizations, how does a leader, kind of piggyback on what Sam said, get their finger on the pulse of the culture so that they can help guide it as it grows?
So my necklace is rubbing on my microphone, so I got to use this one, so thank you. So I do think leaders have they obviously play a critical role in operationalizing culture so it can sustain growth. And it's not something that you can just let happen. Culture doesn't just, people think that culture just happens and you just watch it and you let it flourish, but you actually have to work at it and you have to actually spend time on it. And in the same way that you spend time on your forecasts and you spend time looking at metrics and you spend time coaching your reps, you need to spend time on culture. You need to actually block off time to spend on culture, and you need to think about it a lot. And I spend a lot of my time thinking about it because that is the only way that as the organization grows, I know that we're going to be able to, continue to grow, and we're going to be able to, continue to keep something that's, that's really important to us. And so the way that I've done that is I think it needs to be codified personally. When I started at Infloative, I had a couple reps that I inherited, and once we got up to about 10 reps, I said, all right, now it's time to codify the culture. And I got everyone in a room, and we did a little sticky note exercise where very similar to what you described, we put a sticky note exercise that talked about, what do we believe in, what are our values, what does it mean to be part of an Infloative sales organization. We put them all up on a big wall, then we started to organize them, and then we put it into one of those word things, whatever those are called. And our word is engage, and on each letter there's a value. So E is excel individually and collectively, N is never stop learning, etc. And these are on the walls. These are how I open every single sales meeting, every QBR. This is what we hire against, and so when I'm not there, and then when you promote people and all those things, when I'm not there, it's still there. And so now it lives without me. And that is the goal of a leader, is to codify it, constantly repeat, so that it can live without you as the organization grows.
Hey, can I just build on that real quick? I think the point that you both were speaking to was consistency, because imagine the importance of consistency is inversely related to, the importance of each value is inversely related to how often you get to screw up. So if you have values that are extremely important, you do not get to screw up ever, because your people are always watching. And I have a rep on my team in the crowd. He will know if I'm not living the values of our company, and as soon as I screw up on something critical, like selling as a team sport, he'll know and he'll stop caring. So if you think about it that way, and there are going to be some that are a little more borderline, some that are mission critical, but think about that and whether or not you're showing up that way every single day.
There's a couple thoughts. One is that, exactly to Emmanuel's point, I think that communication is the foundation from which you disseminate culture. I've learned in my career, I think other leaders will share this sentiment, that you have to repeat what you believe. You have to repeat the goals. You have to repeat yourself so often that you feel like you've already communicated that message, and then you have to repeat it a few more times. And so you need to build a culture of communication, because that's the thing that disseminates it. So you have to decide what your values are, then you need to write them down. You need to have quarterly business reviews. You need to have team meetings where you're reinstating and reinforcing the cultures, the beliefs, the values, and you're articulating those into the goals of the organization. So I just think that that's really important.
Yeah, I mean, what Sam's describing to a great extent is this idea of predictability. And that's my objective with all my new managers. I say your goal is to become super predictable as quickly as you can, right? Because you're not going to be around all the time. Your people need to know how to act when you're not around. We ask this all the time in our business whenever we're stuck with a problem. We say, what would our EVP do, right? Because he's so predictable, we know how to act. Maybe we'll go back to Jason for a second. Talking about this idea of how do we hire for culture, right? Because we've all been in these situations where someone who's extremely competent in their role, it just happens to not be right for the culture. And to some extent, interviewing is kind of like dating. We all put a lot of due diligence into it, but sometimes it doesn't work out. So I'm curious, from Jason's perspective, I mean, working at a very fast-growing company, specializing in people and recruiting and onboarding.
We can't screw that up.
No, you can't. How do you solve for that problem? How do you interview?
Sure. So I think building on Emmanuel's point, first it has to be defined, and not just defined organizationally, but defined for your team. So when we're hiring for sales solutions, which is a high growth part of our business, we know that people have to be adaptable, they have to be willing to do high level and low level work. We know probably 6 or 7 things about the cultural components that are critical to being successful on our team, a very role-specific cultural definition, and then we map that to our interview process so that at different stages we're testing for those bits. So when we're asking questions like, tell me about a job or an experience where you achieved a state of flow, that helps us understand whether or not someone can articulate the cultural components that are best suited for them, whether they're consistent with ours. So it starts first with defining it, and then intentionally testing for it as part of the hiring process. And then after that, after you've hired people, you have to do like a year later look back to say, are the things that we tested for the things that really mattered in the success of our sales team? And do we need to shuffle those up? And we actually, at LinkedIn, on our team, we just concluded this exercise, and we ended up moving something that was in the back straight up to the front because we learned it was critical for our team at this stage.
That's a great point. We do the same thing every year in our organization, this idea of what's more important, A or B, B or C, right? And you get this prioritized list, and it's okay for that to be different every year. Mark Roberge, who many people know from HubSpot, wrote a great book called The Sales Acceleration Formula, where he describes, and he was a great advisor to us at our last startup, how they evaluated culture and competencies. And there are 2 take-home messages. Number 1, don't copy us. Okay, just don't assume that what we do is what you do. And number two, be prepared to reevaluate that at various stages of your company, because what I just told you, that was only for the first year. After that, it was like, all bets were off and it was completely different. So it's really important to continue to evaluate your culture, understand what's important to you at that time, and balance these things. Maybe we'll just, one more thing and we'll open up for questions. Sam was mentioning earlier this idea of how do you balance priorities against culture, right? So on one hand, you're trying to balance, let's say, growth versus promotion or attainment, and sometimes these things can be at odds with each other. How do you kind of go about balancing those things?
I think that's especially again, my world, when people hire me, it's usually at a growth stage company. So nobody's hiring me to grow 10% typically. We're typically coming in and trying to grow 50, 60, 100% or more. And so the biggest challenge oftentimes when you're trying to operationalize culture and you're trying to make sure that you hire the right people is that you've got these growth targets and this revenue plan. And that revenue plan, in my case, is often stacked based on the number of AEs that you have, butts and seats, times their quota attainment, times their ability to hit that revenue plan. And that plan is always sitting there, and the board of directors is looking at it, and senior management is looking at it. And the hardest thing to do, but the fundamental thing that you have to do, in my opinion, is you have to solve for the long-term needs of the business first and foremost, which means, the hardest thing to do is you've got your culture defined, you've got your values defined, you've got a candidate that you're not sure about that may not meet the criteria, but in the back of your mind, you know that if you don't make X number of hires in June, by the time October comes around, you might be in a position where you're not able to hit your revenue plan. And I guess what I've learned over time, which is always a difficult lesson to learn, is you kind of, in some sense, need to be a little zen about it. And you need to focus first and foremost on culture, because it's more important to have the right people on the bus and then increase their per person productivity than it is to just put bodies in desks because you're supposed to hit a hiring plan. You'll burn leads, you'll not hit the right level of quota attainment, they won't ramp up as quickly as you'd hope because they're not the right people. So that's one part of the message. And similarly, last point I'll make is just on performance management. Your A players can all see it when there's C or lower players that are being tolerated, that are being allowed to consume the organizational resources. And so even though it may be difficult, and even though these are difficult conversations, you have to keep trying to solve for increasing the average of the team, whatever that may be, trying to increase the net quality of each person on the team. And that may mean that, hey, hiring can be a probabilistic exercise. Nobody's going to get it right 100% of the time. You have to be willing to make those tough decisions as you grow.
The infinite game, to bring it full circle. Playing the infinite game, that's great. All right, we're a minute over time. Do we want to open it up for questions, or maybe, sure, a couple questions? And by the way, the next session is lunch, so we're happy to hang off onto the side and answer questions offline.
Hi, my name is Sachin. I've been an entrepreneur for 13 years. And when Emmanuel said you have to codify it, something just struck me. Can you set goals and measure that culture is really, because it's very fluid, and that's why we talk so much about it. Is there a method by which somebody can say, yes, we have now went from A to B in the dimension of culture? Have you ever thought about it? Have you ever seen something like that?
Yeah, I'll open up. At Salesforce, we do a couple things. We measure coaching interactions. So we believe that the coaching interactions and one-on-ones is really, really important. So we measure how often those happen. But then we also do a manager survey, for example, where we ask people the question, would you fight to work with us again? Right? And we do have our goal is to get a certain number of people to say, yes, we would fight to work with us again. And encapsulated in that is a whole lot of culture. What have you guys seen?
We don't have a survey, so I don't measure it that religiously, but I do think you can measure, examples of where, like the example that I gave of the rep, right? So you can measure, you can see how many examples of culture being exemplified in your organization, and as long as you constantly call them out, right? And you very, very publicly call them out, then you'll start to see those multiply, and then eventually you'll get there. But I think early on you have to call them out all the time and just look for the examples, and then eventually it will kind of do the flywheel effect.
All right, we're getting the hook. We're getting the hook right now. Lynn's coming up to give us the hook. So thank you so much, and thanks to all the panelists. Hope you enjoyed it.
We're giving you guys the hook, but I know you're being generous with your time, so you guys can just stick around and we can take some of the questions that I know people were eager to ask. But right now it's lunchtime, so lunch, if you guys have been here before, it's out in the expo area, lining both sides of the wall. There's buffets, please enjoy. Come back here at 12:30, we've got a demo jam. Demo
Thank you,
jams
man.
are
It was
amazing,
great.
and it's a great way for you to see what technologies are going to be helpful to you to be more productive and get greater insights. So 6 companies have 3 minutes each to wow you with their products. Bring your lunch back here and enjoy some entertainment at 12:30. Then we'll resume our breakouts this afternoon. Thank you, everybody, and thanks a lot, team.